Welcome to the diverse, accessible, equitable, and inclusion technology-enabled mobility. So about this session, my name is Lisa Ballard. I am an integration planner with the Regional Transit Coordination Division at WashDOT and also Vice President of ITS Washington. And we have Carol Schweiger and Victoria Sheehan here today. As ITS and transportation professionals, we're beginning to recognize ITS is not always accessible or beneficial to everyone. We know that some ITS deployments have hurt segments of our population who have long gone unheard and are invisible and vulnerable. This session will examine ITS from that perspective. This is an interactive session. So first we'll hear from our speakers and take some questions. Then we're going to break out into separate groups where we will ask all of you to provide some responses to some questions that we've prepared. And finally, we will reconvene and report back on what we heard. So now our speakers. We have Carol Schweiger, who's president of Schweiger Consulting, and Victoria Sheehan, Commissioner of New Hampshire Department of Transportation and president of AASHTO. We are incredibly fortunate to have these two amazing speakers from New England with us today, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what they have to say. So I will hand this over to Carol.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for that intro. And I'm excited to be speaking with not only you, but Victoria. Fortunately, last month, both Victoria and I were in Germany, which is where my background is from, in what you're seeing here in Hamburg, Germany, at the ITS World Congress, where we had a really excellent session talking about basically the same topic. So hopefully you can see my screen. And I'm just going to run through some slides here to get everybody sort of thinking about what does this topic. I've been talking about it for several years. I would say in the last year or so, the discussions about this topic have increased exponentially, and that's all very good. I know in Hamburg, we had several sessions on this topic where we had a lot of really, really good discussion. So let's get into my presentation here. So I'm going to give you three perspectives from me. Now, granted, there are a lot more than three perspectives on this topic. So I'm sure a lot of you can think of other things, but I'm going to go through what those three perspectives are and kind of talk about how could we actually maybe deal with some of these aspects of the diversity, inclusion, equality, and accessibility issues when we talk about ITS. And then I'm going to give you a few examples at the very end, and then we'll move to Victoria. So when I talk about three perspectives, the first one on the top of the slide is really the overall topic that we're discussing in our session today. We want to make sure that we're incorporating things like gender, accessibility in terms of really two things: physical accessibility to ITS technologies or systems, as well as accessibility who may not have any technology to access these systems. And we don't want to think about this as a sort of after the fact. Us that have been in the ITS world for a long time, we felt like we really didn't consider these things very well at the beginning, a long time ago. Then when you drill down a little bit further, let's talk about the equity of new mobility technologies. So let's say there's a new bike share system. How do you access a bike share? Typically, it's an app on a smartphone. What if someone who wants to use the bike share doesn't have a smartphone? So we need to be designing these systems to have alternatives for people who might not have access to the technology. And then down at the bottom, I don't know if anyone in the audience has read the book called Invisible Women. And it's really about, it's not specifically about ITS, but it's about how a lot of data collection, data analysis, and usage of data is actually very biased, but we often don't know that. So the point of that book is a lot of systems have been developed from a male perspective rather than actually looking at what other gender populations might need as part of the system that's being designed. So just a few thoughts about each of these. So an overall approach, this is a company that provides mobility on demand services. And their challenge has been to design services that take all of these factors into account. So they've come up with an approach that it makes sense to a lot of us that have some systems engineering background, but it also makes sense that we're actually incorporating the whole areas of accessibility, inclusion, and equity into the mobility on demand systems that this particular company has been designing. So obviously you need to ask the users, and I would argue non-users, what is their particular environment? What are their needs as it relates to, in this case, mobility on demand? And then what are the different populations of people that mobility on demand is trying to serve? We need to understand a lot about the characteristics of all of those populations. And then what is really the solution that's going to meet the needs that we identified at the very beginning? So this is a process from a systems engineering perspective that's not necessarily new, but it drills a little bit further into incorporating all of the different people that we're trying to serve. I'm not going to read this slide, but I do want people to understand that the idea about developing frameworks for developing technology systems, it's not brand new, but as I mentioned at the beginning, there's a lot more work being done, but a lot of these studies have, some of them go back to 2016, but we've kind of been talking around this topic for a while. Now, some thoughts that I actually gained from some folks in some of these equity related sessions at the ITS World Congress had some really good ideas about the kinds of things that agencies are beginning to do to look at things like equity. DFT is the Department for Transport in the UK, and they actually have defined almost like a 4-element process for all of their projects, ITS or not ITS, to do an equality impact assessment. And so this is the approach that they've taken. Again, none of this is really new, but this impact assessment has been formalized now. So I think that's very, very positive. And then in one of the sessions that I set up, I had the general manager of ITS UK talk a little bit about sort of this issue of potential data bias and how we really don't necessarily know that it's there. And so here are some thoughts about how to actually consider that when you're collecting data, you're analyzing it, or you're using the data. And it's somewhat similar to what was on the prior slide. You know, who in this case, we go sort of one step further. Who's designing the systems that are, generating the data? Who has access to the data that's being collected? And we're all very concerned about that these days, especially. Where is the data stored? And really, how long is it stored, and exactly how is it being used? And one really good example that the general manager from ITS UK gave was, with social media, there's a lot of data that's being collected, but it could be used in a negative way. And the example was in a country like Afghanistan, which may not look favorably on women playing sports. It could be combing social media, looking for instances where women are playing sports. And it could be a very negative thing. So we really need to be concerned about, where is the data stored? How long is it stored for? Exactly what is being stored? There's also a project that I wanted everyone to know about from the Transportation Research Board. And here we're looking at how to really assess the impact of technologies like those that we use in ITS on what is called underserved populations. This project is going to come up with a guidebook and a tool so that agencies and governments can actually look at what the impact is and potentially what do they need to do to those systems to make them accessible to underserved populations. This project is going to go through 2023. So there's a lot of really good work going on there. I think a very, very positive project that's happening. Another project, which is called the For All study, which has been done in Sweden. Sweden was looking at how to make some of the newer technologies accessible to everyone. And they determined pretty early on that they really needed to have at least these two checklists as they were developing systems that would be available, transportation, sort of advanced transportation systems, like using automated vehicles in public transit service, for example. So they came up with these checklists. So we're looking at all populations, no matter what the population is. And we also want to make sure that they can utilize these sort of new mobility services to be able to go to work, get an education, have cultural experiences, go to entertainment, healthcare, et cetera. So that's just an example there. Here are some other examples. One of the panelists in the session that Victoria spoke in and I moderated in Hamburg is someone who has a disability and obviously is an advocate for transportation services that were accessible But there's one thing that sticks in my mind about what she spoke about. She had recently been in Iceland with her family, and she has some mobility issues. And one thing she noticed was going into some shops in Reykjavik, that the shops had a ramp going into the shop itself. And she was very pleased about that, number one. But number two, she thought how easy it was for a shop to make itself accessible, and how that would be just such a very simple thing to do. But that's not what a lot of people are thinking about. So we always need to sort of have that in our mind. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Victoria.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to start sharing my screen. But thank you so much for the invitation to be with you all today. It's great to have a chance to speak on a panel again with Carol. She and I did have a wonderful experience in Hamburg, and it was really refreshing being at the World Congress and having an agenda that was full of sessions on this topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion, specifically as we talk about technology and ensuring mobility for all. And so my background is a picture of historic Portsmouth. I thought with so many of you being on the West Coast, you'd appreciate a perspective from those of us who live on the Northeast. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that we're doing in New England in this space. And Carol really set the stage in terms of talking about why we need to think differently and how we can approach deploying these solutions in a way that builds out the system for everyone to use. But I want to take a step back and talk about the inequities that exist today. And I think if we're going to be successful into the future, it's always important to take the time to really understand the unintended consequences of prior decisions. So first of all, I want to talk about affordability. And this is one of the biggest challenges that we still have to overcome in this country. And so I want you to take a look at this chart. This divides the population into 5 quadrants. Group 1 are the lowest earning 20%. And unfortunately, this population spends almost 30% of their earnings on transportation. The next 20% of the population, group 2, spend about 22% of their earnings on transportation. The next group, group 3, spend 17%. And so you'll see that this is the root cause of a lot of our inequities across our transportation systems. And why is this the case? Obviously, in this country, we have invested significantly in our roadway infrastructure, and everything was built out to accommodate the personal vehicle. And so with the cost of car ownership being disproportionately high, this is why we have those, the lower income level, really struggling to pay for transportation. And as we all know, as transportation professionals, we're in the business of connecting people to places and people to opportunity. And so the cost is something that we have to continue to keep focusing on. Because in contrast, this is the chart for the European Union, where the story is quite different. In the EU, they have not built out their system primarily for personal vehicles. There's a lot more transportation options, and making sure that those options are affordable has always been a policy that was embraced. And as a result, the poorest 20% in the EU spend as little as 7.5% of their income on transportation. And so this was an unintended consequence of how we've approached mobility in the past. So why this contrast? Well, we built roads and connected suburbs to cities. Over 75% of the commuting trips in the United States are those taken by one person in one vehicle. And what's always disappointing to me is that many of those trips are between 1 and 8 kilometers, a short distance that easily could be a distance traveled on a different mode of transportation. So as we look to the future, we need to think about how we've approached transportation planning in the past and make sure that we don't repeat some of the trends or perpetuate the situation that we're faced with today. And that's why Carol emphasized this need to look at different frameworks as we start to think about mobility and equity. One of the ones that I refer to often is the 2018 mobility framework that was established by the Green Mining Institute. And you'll see that affordability is number 1 on that list with goal number 1. And so that's why I always start from that perspective. But then accessibility, efficiency, reliability, those are all equally important. And starting to think that it's not just about the mobility, it's about all of the quality of life factors that come along with having a transportation system that works for everybody. And so especially as we now are working to develop solutions and find ways to deliver on the projects that will be associated with the new revenue that's coming to state DOTs through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, there's going to be a lot of emphasis on sort of goal areas 2 and goal areas 3. How can we reduce greenhouse gas emissions, reduce vehicle miles traveled, and think about all of the benefits to our economy and making sure that everybody has access so that they personally can have that opportunity to earn a living and better themselves. And so these aren't necessarily the ways that we approach transportation planning in the past. Many times we were the afterthought. The transportation planners were connecting people to the places they wanted to go, as opposed to citing housing and citing all of the different services that people need to access in a way that would allow us to provide the most efficient and effective and most importantly, affordable transportation system. And so more and more, we're embedding transportation in the early conversations around land use. I think across this country, we have a lack of affordable housing, especially in cities. But if we focus only on housing and don't think about that family that also needs to access childcare and drop their kids at school on the way to get to work from the housing, we're going to be missing opportunities. We're creating a transportation system that is not as efficient and not as affordable for everyone. And there's also other types of disparate impacts that we can't lose sight of. Specifically, those around gender. One of the statistics that's that helps explain some of the gap in terms of income potential for different genders is just access to car ownership, because access to a car is what is necessary to be able to pursue certain job opportunities. And so there are 55% of the cars in the US are owned by men, while only 35% are owned by women. So continuing to think about this, not just a transportation investment choice, but also investment choice that's going to have lasting impacts on everyone who's trying to use our system. Likewise, when we start to look at who owns vehicle by race or ethnicity, there's disparities in that category as well. And of course, if you don't have access, then you don't have access to opportunity. And so as we start to talk about ITS and mobility as a service and all of these different solutions, learning from that history, learning those unintended consequences of the decisions that were made in the past, and making sure that we don't repeat history is extremely important. And there continues to be barriers to the use of some of these technologies we've already deployed. So in the tolling world, as an example, many individuals can't get access to transponders and travel through open road tolling lanes, which would shorten their commutes because they don't have access to a bank account. They're the unbanked population, and therefore they can't have money go onto their account. So continuing to have solutions, whether it's cash payment networks where people can go into stores and purchase cards and still pay cash to top up their accounts to travel on the transit system or to travel on a toll system. We need to be thinking about these solutions and make sure nobody gets left behind. In New Hampshire, as an example, if you have a New Hampshire Easy Pass account to travel on our toll roads, you get a 30% discount. So who needs that discount the most but those individuals who don't have access to credit and maybe are unbanked? So we want to make sure that we're providing as many opportunities for them to have those same benefits that other users of the system have. And so I guess I'll leave you with this as we move into the more open discussion part of this forum. But we really have to think about the promise of these technologies. As we talk about the deployment of EVs and CAVs, we all want to improve air quality and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We all want to realize the safety benefits that come from connected and automated vehicles. We want to take that driver out of the driver's seat, but we cannot deploy these technologies in a way that leave people behind. Right now, just a lack of access to a smartphone is a barrier to accessing some of these technologies. With seniors and individuals with disabilities who can't use some of the micromobility solutions that have been deployed as last mile solutions for gaps in our transportation network. And as Carol mentioned, that lack of data or that misinterpreting of data, having preconceived ideas about what the data is telling you will mean that we aren't making truly data-driven decisions. So ensuring that we collect the right information, that we interview all the users of our systems and really understand how people would like to travel, not just how they're traveling today, and build the systems that work for them is something that I know I'm committed to. It's just been really refreshing over the last couple of years to see more and more people start to understand the importance of doing things differently from how we did in the past. Carol, I'll turn it back to you, or Lisa, I'm not sure who's going to.
Yes, thank you so much, Victoria and Carol. I have a question for you all, and then if anyone in the audience wants to type in questions into the Q&A area on the that would be great. So my question, that graph between the inverse relationship between income and expense on transportation, that really stood out to me. And why is that so different from Europe? So what do you think, what's an example of something that a transportation engineer or a planner might be doing? What data or what data-driven decision might we be taking that's contributing to that, perhaps unintentionally?
Well, I think the biggest contributor is actually the lack of affordable housing. And this is something that we've been looking at in New Hampshire. When individuals don't have access to affordable housing in proximity to where they work, they're forced to move further away because house prices are lower or rents are lower. But then that actually increases their transportation costs significantly. And one of the things that we've been looking at as a state is what's called the cliff effect. So if employers are struggling to attract a workforce, they increase the hourly wages. But to be able to access that employment, if you're spending more on transportation, then you're not actually going to realize the benefits of that additional hourly rate. And then further to that, it could be such that you actually lose some of your benefits, which means you're less inclined to even want to accept that position. So what we have been focused on is partnering with the business community and encouraging them to support local transit. If they can invest in local transit and we have sustainable sources of revenue, we can offer more fixed route service from communities outside of some of our small cities. That will provide more access for a larger number of people, which helps address the workforce challenges for the businesses. But it puts the dollars where they're going to have the most benefit. So rather than one individual benefiting, we can provide a service that serves more people. And so it's not so much about how we're looking at data, it's about how we're having the conversations with all of our partners, making sure that we're engaging the business community, that we understand the challenges that they're facing, and making transportation part of the conversation. We've been, like I said earlier, left out in some respects, and always are trying to address the challenges from the hand we've been dealt versus helping inform others so they can make better choices. And ultimately, then we'll be able to run the most efficient and effective system.
Thank you. Carol, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I mean, Victoria said it so perfectly. I think now as planners, before I got involved in more of the technology side, I've been a planner as well. And in years past, we really did not connect the dots the way they need to be connected so that we don't create these untenable situations for people who become more disadvantaged as we ignore these things. I remember just a couple of years back when we all had these discussions about how the millennials were traveling completely differently than anybody else. And we kind of had this really serious focus on that particular segment of the population. And I dare say that we were short-sighted by just really focusing on that population. But what it did do in a positive way was to bring in these other factors that Victoria mentioned about housing. A lot of millennials, before they started having children, wanted to be in a city, in an urban environment, like a city center. And then when they started to have children, it was like what my parents did in their generation. When people started to have children, they moved to the suburbs. But we need to connect those dots. And the only other thing that I wanted to quickly mention, at the federal level, the ITS for Us program that's going on now there are several projects that are connecting the dots between health and transportation, between education, between housing. Some of those projects really have a significant focus on bringing those other parts of people's lives into the transportation picture where they really need to be.
Thank you so much. Okay, we're going to now transition to breakout groups.
I can tell you every time we have any conversations about this topic, it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, which is a good thing because we want to make sure we're covering what we should. So
I'll go ahead and share the screen.
great. So let's see. All right. So I will I'll sort of give the report out, and anybody who is in the group, if you want to say anything in addition to what we kind of covered, please feel free to do so. So we were talking about the overall topic. We weren't really drilling into specific technology or talking about data, but that was, we were kind of at the 35,000 or 40,000 foot view. So if you can flip over to the first question that our group talked about, we were just saying, how do we incorporate these things into our planning and design processes? And my premise has been, being in this field for a very long time, at the beginning, we talked amongst ourselves. We didn't do a lot of talking to the whole community and the groups that really are involved. So in this question, the input was, we need to include diverse groups. And I think, Victoria, you really set the stage really well by even mentioning things like affordable housing. Years ago, when we did transportation plans, even before we were talking about ITS, we didn't always really include that kind of stakeholder in our work. So including the diverse groups to bring more voices to the table is going to hopefully make sure that we don't leave people behind, as we've done in the past. And identifying all the potential stakeholder groups is not always the easiest thing if we haven't really thought about who the stakeholder groups are. It's been in ITS relatively closed. We talk amongst ourselves, we talk with similar agencies, but we don't always open up to a larger group of stakeholders. So I don't know if anybody wants to add anything, anybody from the group. Let's move on to the second question. So here we're trying to get a sense of what's the most challenging aspect of making ITS or ITS-driven systems accessible to everybody. And here we again need to make sure we're not leaving groups behind. So here we talked a bit about Victoria, your example of tolling systems. If you've got that transponder, it's got to be tied to a bank account or a credit card, and you're giving those people the discount, but the people who don't have a bank account or a credit card, they don't get the discount. They have to pay full freight when they get billed for being on a toll road. So we need to make sure, again, by bringing in the right stakeholders, that we're not just designing for the majority, but that we're looking at what's called in that TRB project, underserved populations. How do we, I think the economics of things was also brought up as being really important. An example here for me is mobility on demand services. Anyone who's been in the public transportation field and has dealt with paratransit or demand response service knows how expensive that is. And now we're designing all of these micro transit services, which is taking paratransit to a new level. But have we really looked at the economics of, there may only be a handful of people that are going to use the service. So economics are very, very challenging here. In our group, we also talked about the fact that this isn't do it once and it's done. This is an ongoing issue. It's going to change. COVID is a great example of how everything had to change. We didn't really have a choice. But in the kinds of things we're talking about, we're going to have to keep being more nimble and more flexible to be able to continually address this issue, because it's not just a one-time thing. And so that we are not always in ITS planning and in ITS engineering, we're not always the most nimble. So I think that's another very challenging aspect, to be flexible. And we can go to the third question. And then here I was just looking for, what are people's two most important actions, and expanding on the people that we're including in the process, people who we would not normally consider as stakeholders. It was brought up that actually political action, which may result in regulation, is really, really important. It was brought up, the private sector that is providing some of these new ITS services are looking for where the money is and want to be part of that, whether it's regulation setting or, whether it has to do with data collection. We've actually seen some pretty contentious situations around that, but that is probably one of the most important actions we can be looking at to make sure that these systems are accessible to everyone. And then education and outreach. If you bring the stakeholders in and they don't know what you're talking about, you're not going to get useful input from them. So I'll leave it at that.
And I moderated group 2, where we were focusing on data generation, analysis, and use, and how do we prevent data bias. And so we had 3 questions. On the first one, are there specific aspects of ITS that are more vulnerable to data bias? And some of the conversations, first rooted in our conversation, is that we all come from a different background. We have different specialties within the ITS transportation realm. And so what makes sense for safety is different than what makes sense for access to transit, or what makes sense for traffic signal coordination. But a big first step among all of us, even though some of us have never really even thought about, we do the technical work. How do we even think about this when our job is to design the fiber background or whatever it is? And so one first thing is to recognize that there is bias in the data. And that just because we are using data, that doesn't mean that there isn't bias. And that's probably the big first thing. And then also there's different types of data for different types of, it says vehicles here, that's my typo problem. Travelers, do we have good bicycle data? It's easy to get AADT data, but it's hard to get other types of data. And we have a new assistant professor from UW-Tacoma who was exciting to join us. And so she says that micromobility and its data source is fascinating to her. And she wants to look and learn more about that and study that more. And do we have good data for people with mobility issues? We have pretty good data on the transit systems, but we don't really have good data for the individual people. When we're looking at safety data and the police reports, we know that the police reports don't reflect everything. So distracted driving is reflected in there, but how accurate is that? And then the reliance on vehicle delay as a measure, that's my personal pet peeve at this moment. Okay, so the second question we had, we kind of skipped over this one. What are the 2 biggest issues in ITS data bias or data ethics? And we think interpreting the data is huge in that. And then on this one, the third question, how should the ITS industry address potential data bias? And a little bit of editing problems here, so, but that's fine. We need an approach. We need to work with professors and people who are really focusing on this. What data do we want to use? What methodology should we be using? And that's probably true for each of the different areas of focus that each of us work in. And finally, we need to remember that we need to have robust data, but it also needs to be backed up by people's lived experiences, and a combination of the two. With that, Victoria.
Okay, well, our group was looking more at how to assess the mobility, how to assess the equity of some of these new mobility technologies. So the first question that we were focused on was around, what are the most critical equity issues that we need to address? So we really built upon some of the observations that I had shared earlier, and sort of affirmed that the lack of affordable housing has meant that people who are then forced to live outside of the city have longer commutes. And time is money, and so that's time away from the workplace potentially, as well as time away from family. And so we need to really focus on the length of the commute. And it was an observation that many times the length of commute is significantly longer if you use public transportation. So that's continuing to encourage people to drive. But then with everybody commuting by car, the level of congestion is such that we are still seeing folks spending, 90 minutes or more behind the wheel of their car, getting to and from work and driving relatively short distances. A lot of our ITS solutions, I think, focus on communicating travel, trip times and such, but ultimately we're not addressing the root cause, which is why people are choosing the mode of transportation that they are. Other concerns were around smartphones and the technologies that aren't accessible for everyone. I think it was mentioned, we've been so focused on the potential of these solutions, we certainly haven't taken the time to think about everyone who does get left behind when we deploy technologies. And then there was also an observation that we have been focused on the car, that even the most basic mode of transportation, walking and biking, isn't safe. And there's a lot of concerns around equity in that space as well. Our second question was, what can the ITS industry do to ensure equity, diversity, accessibility, and inclusion? So a lot of the same comments that you've heard from the other groups, we really have to stop and think about all users, engaging employers in the business community to understand what their needs are and how that's going to change, how people need to move around and how they're going to access our system. And this challenge of finding new ways to engage different populations. One of the participants brought up this idea of asking the right questions. I'd shared some data around car ownership, but it was asked, do we really know who is driving vehicles, not just who owns the vehicles? And given that households share cars, or that people even borrow cars from friends or neighbors to make simple trips like going to the grocery store, do we have a bias because of the data that's available? Do we have to ask questions in a new way to have the right information to make an informed decision? And then our third question was, are there specific examples of how these factors were not considered in an ITS project or mobility service? The example that came up was the scooters. Not only are some of the scooters not accessible for individuals with disabilities, but further to that, the way that they are abandoned or located along sidewalks causes additional problems, because then there's an actual physical infrastructure issue with a lack of adequate space on sidewalks. So that was just one example. It's not just that the solution itself isn't accessible for everybody, but then there's the unintended consequences depending on how that solution is deployed. So that's some of the thoughts from our group. We were a small group, and we only heard from a few voices, but it seemed to be very similar conversation to what the other breakout sessions focused on.
Yeah. One thing I'd like to add to your second question here, how can the industry ensure that we consider equity? I think we need to have a diverse workforce, I think, because our lived experiences are reflected in the decisions that we make.
That's what I say to my employees at New Hampshire DOT every day, and to the consultants and contractors that we partner with. We need a workforce that reflects the people that we serve. Otherwise, we're not going to come up with the right solutions.
Yeah. Carol, you have some closing, or what's your takeaways? How do you pull this all together?
So there's, again, every time we discuss this, it sort of creates even more thinking about how do we deal with this particular issue. But I think just to kind of touch on a couple of things, Lisa, in the group that you were leading and talking about data, there was a conversation that I had back pre-COVID. I think it was the last conference I went to before COVID hit, at the end of 2019, and was in the UK, and there was a lot of discussion about data and potential bias and how we really don't always know how the data is being used. And I think in our industry, we are now seeing new positions like data scientists. I'm noticing there are new positions coming up, whether it's the public sector or the private sector, where those kinds of skills, they're hiring specifically for those skills. But there was also a lot of discussion about data ethics and how you disclose exactly what you've done with the data. And I go back to my slide that sort of has those questions. You know, what data are you collecting? How long are you keeping it? Who has access to it? What are you really doing with it? We had a lot of discussion about that at the ITS World Congress. But I think back to a point that was made in my group, that data scientist role is relatively new. Not everybody has them yet, but that's a change in our industry where that role should probably, anybody who's in that role should be dealing with the data ethics side of things. And we don't talk about that. We just set people off and say, okay, you're going to go do that analysis. You know, we really, it's not like we have to explain to everybody about the weeds, you know, and this is the detailed analysis we're doing, but what are the assumptions, and, you know, how is this system being designed, taking into account diverse populations and abilities and those kinds of things. So I think, you know, there's a lot more to be discussed on the data side of things, but it's really important. And one of the best things, this is my sort of my perspective anyway, one of the best things that happened at the ITS World Congress in one of these sessions is that people actually got up and said, I was never really as aware of this as I am now. And I'm very thankful to know that this is important, but how exactly do I incorporate this in my job? And I was so excited that people actually started to think about it, again, it's not a one-time thing. It's constant, and it has to be part of our planning process that we go through, whether it's ITS or it's something else. So that was just so positive. Just starting this discussion with the group today, I think really starts you on a wonderful course to deal with this as you go forward. So those are my couple of thoughts.
Thank you so much, Carol. Victoria, any closing thoughts?
I think it's just important to keep having this conversation. And it was refreshing being at the World Congress, as I said before, and having so many sessions on this topic and having the opportunity to dive into the details. One of the things that I shared with my group is when we built these solutions in a way that they're accessible for everyone, they are easier and more efficient for all users. And so if we take the time, it's not extra effort to serve this smaller population. It's extra effort that will bring better tools and solutions for all the folks that will be using these technologies. And that's something that is often overlooked.
I am so grateful that you two were able to join us today in Washington. And I look forward to further conversations at ITS Washington on this subject. And would like to wrap up the session with that thanks, and also to the audience, thank you. Appreciate the audience joining the session.